Arm forward cannons. They'll get the message. Any of you want a mutiny? Now's the time. No takers? Then fire!
Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So today we're going to be looking at a criminally underrated first person shooter, and one that I was just recently introduced to for the first time, Bulletstorm, originally released in 2011, developed by People Can Fly. More specifically we're going to be looking at the remastered version from 2017, known as the Full Clip Edition, since that's the version of the game that I played. So Bulletstorm is a game that I'd heard of, yet never got round to playing until very recently for whatever reason. In fact, what actually led to me buying the game was the fact that I was in the process of reviewing several Duke Nukem games. Upon downloading Duke Nukem Manhattan Project from the Microsoft Store, which I reviewed in my last video, link in description, I randomly came across this game, and saw that the game had an add-on that featured Duke Nukem. Naturally I was curious about it, and I decided to check the game out. And I have to say, right off the bat, I was very surprised by this game. So the game is of course a first-person shooter. The story of the game is an interesting one. It takes place in the 26th century, and has sort of a post-apocalyptic science fiction vibe to it. The universe is ran by a tyrannical faction known as the Confederation of Planets. You play as Grayson Hunt, the leader of a team of elite assassins known as Dead Echo, voiced excellently by Stephen Blum.
That's the Confederation's prize warbird. General Serrano will be on board. Christmas come early, boys.
The game begins with you interrogating a bounty hunter who was sent to kill you and your team. You learn during a flashback level in the game's intro that the team were once under the command of a Confederation General, Victor Serrano, who acts as the game's main villain, after assassinating a target who the team believed to be a dangerous criminal.
On my mark. 3, 2, 1.
It was revealed that he was in fact an innocent reporter, and the people that they'd been assassinating were all basically innocent political targets. This leads to the team essentially going rogue, and being hunted down by the Confederation for the next 10 years. In the present day, Grayson and his team come under attack from General Serrano's ship. In a drunken rage, Grayson attempts to fly his ship into Serrano's, taking both ships down in the process. This leads to both ships crash landing on the nearby planet Stygia, where miraculously Gray and his team survive. Without giving away too much of the story, Gray and his team will have to work together to find a way to escape the planet. It's actually a surprisingly complex story when you get into it, and I enjoyed it very much. What I like about the story is that it's incredibly self-aware, and doesn't take itself too seriously, well at least not most of the time. Occasionally there are some tonal inconsistencies, but I'll get to that later. As far as the overall gameplay goes, it's a lot more fast-paced and hectic than a lot of first-person shooters from the time. The game focuses heavily on combat. The shooting mechanics are pretty much perfect, and quite complex for the time. In fact, I'd go as far as to say I've never played one quite like it. Throughout the game you'll find numerous different enemy types, as well as weapons, each of which feel very unique from one another. What's cool about the game's combat is how everything in the game feels specifically designed to accommodate it, including the level design and the environments. It's an incredibly interactive and creative game. As far as the game's weapons go, you start off with a carbine assault rifle, known as a Peacemaker carbine. This is the weakest gun in the game, and it's the one you'll be relying on throughout most of the early levels. You have a revolver known as a Screamer. This is an incredibly powerful and accurate handgun, and it's great for scoring headshots easily. You have a Bone Duster, which is a badass shotgun with 4 barrels. This gun is insanely powerful from close range, being able to blast enemies to pieces, with most of them being taken out in one hit. However, it's practically useless from long range. You have a sniper rifle known as a headhunter. What's interesting about the sniper rifle is it actually has remote control bullets. You first target an enemy and then manually direct the bullet towards them in slow motion, taking them out in style. If you lose a target, you automatically lose control of your bullet. This can be frustrating, but you do get used to it after a while. You also have some explosive weapons, for example a flail gun. This fires 2 grenades at a time that are chained together, and they'll latch onto enemies before exploding. A bouncer, which is basically a heavy grenade launcher. The bouncer lets you launch a grenade at an enemy that will bounce towards them, and you can choose to detonate it remotely. These are insanely powerful and useful for defeating tougher enemies. And you have my personal favourite weapon in the game, the penetrator. No, not that penetrator. A gun that fires huge spinning drills at enemies, essentially turning them into shish kebab. Seriously, the penetrator is one of the most badass and hilarious weapons I've ever seen in gaming. One of them weapons that was a genius idea. In addition to all these guns, you also have a huge chain gun. The chain gun is basically a minigun turret that can be picked up and used, and is insanely powerful. However, can't actually be added to your infantry and is battery powered, usually running out of power very quickly. It's a badass weapon that you get access to in a few predetermined locations. In addition to guns, you also have an item called an energy leash. The energy leash is something you'll be relying on the vast majority of the game, since it's incorporated into both the game's combat, as well as traversing the levels, and interacting with the environment. It's a glove that Gray finds early in the game that allows him to launch a whip-like beam of energy in front of him. The whip can be used to grab items and weapons in the environment, as well as to unlock new areas and remove obstacles in your way. In addition to that, you can use it to grab a hold of enemies, pulling them towards you, allowing you to hit them with melee attacks, which basically consists of kicking them. And you can even throw them directly into hazards in the environment. I mentioned before how the game's level design accommodates the combat. There are basically hazards all over the place, and this can be used to help you defeat enemies. You can take out enemies in a variety of interesting and creative ways, and this is really fun to do. What's cool about this is that every single combat encounter you run into in the game is entirely unique, making for some truly memorable combat. The game does its best to encourage you to experiment with the interactive environment by adding a feature called skill shots. The skill shots are unique achievements you get for performing certain tricks and combat moves. There are many of these, most of which you'll get by purely experimenting, and trying out different combat moves as well as weapons. By performing these skill shots, you'll be rewarded with points. These points act as currency for the game. You can use them to purchase new weapons, as well as ammo for your weapons. You can even buy upgrades for each of your weapons, including higher ammo capacity, and you can even purchase a unique charge ability for each weapon. The charge ability acts as a powerful new attack. For example, the shotgun can unleash a flammable blast that can set multiple enemies alight at once. The carbine can basically vaporize enemies instantly. The revolver can even be converted into a powerful flare gun. These charge attacks are really badass, and they do their bit to add more variety to the game's combat. Even the leash has its own charge attack, the thumper. This allows you to launch an enemy straight up into the air, leading to some extremely badass finishing moves, as well as more skill shots. You can even do this to multiple enemies at once. This is badass. The combat of the game has the right balance between brutal, graphic realism, and over-the-top, flat-out bizarre brutality. Sometimes it's even hilarious. The physics of the game are a lot deeper and more complex than a lot of shooters from the time. For example, enemies will react to being shot differently, depending on where you hit them, and what weapon you used, and it's surprisingly brutal and realistic. Body parts will get realistically dismembered, and it's really satisfying to blast your way through enemies. Speaking of enemies, in addition to weapons, you also have plenty of enemy variety. The planet Stygia is populated by all manner of vile creatures and gangs. The two main gangs of the game are the Skulls and the Creeps, who are at war with one another, and you find yourself stuck in the middle of the conflict. There are different versions of these enemies. You have smaller, more agile enemies who are difficult to grab with your leash, and will need to be shot first. And you have larger, more durable enemies. You have enemies who will use guns as well as melee attacks, as well as enemies that will run right at you and explode in your face. You have these huge tank-like enemies called mini-bosses. Yeah, that's actually what they're called. These are usually armoured and take a specific strategy to bring down. Later in the game you take on these creatures called burnouts. These are fully mutated humans that charge at you and try to overwhelm you with melee attacks. They're also highly resistant to regular attacks, meaning you will have to either target their weak spots, or use the environment to defeat them. In the finale of the game you take on heavily armoured elite troopers called Final Echo, and you have tougher variants called Heavy Echo. Again, these are highly resistant to your attacks, so you may need to be a bit more creative to defeat them. So yeah, the game has plenty of enemy variety as well as weapons to choose from, making the combat so much more varied, and keeping it much fresher than your average shooter. This of course adds to the replay value, since it's fun to replay the game and see what skill shots you can unlock that you may have missed before, as well as experiment with different weapons and combat strategies. It takes a surprising amount of skill to play, and as I said before, it's so varied and it honestly never feels repetitive. The game also has quite a bit of level and location variety. Some areas of the game are bright and vibrant, others are darker and more gloomy. You get levels that take place in space, levels outside, levels in the sewers, levels underground, levels in abandoned cities, levels in caves. So much variety in terms of the game's visual style and aesthetic. There's also a lot of variety in the gameplay. In addition to the regular combat, you also have some climbing sections, as well as a pretty badass chase section. You even have a couple of flying sections. There's even a section of the game where you take control of a huge mech, and can use it to blast away hordes of enemies. This was badass and really fun. One of my favourite parts of the game. What helps to keep the game interesting in addition to all this is the story and dialogue. I mentioned before that the game doesn't take itself too seriously. Gray is an incredibly witty and funny character who's always making wisecracks, and reacting to every situation in a way that's kind of meta. The back and forth as well as the banter between him and the other characters is pretty funny at times, and the voice acting is top notch.
Heavy resistance! Lucky for you, there's a Confederate-sanctioned general keeping you safe!
Oh, and here I thought we were stuck with a psychopathic war criminal who needs his mouth washed out.
Who's gonna do the washing, boy? You?
Just let me load myself.
It's funny, every time I hear Stephen Blum's voice, I always think of Wolverine, since he voiced him in several games in the X-Men series, including X-Men Legends. But I digress. In addition to Gray, you have a few other characters. Ishii, who is your main companion throughout the game. He's your friend who is injured during the crash and basically becomes a cyborg, who is constantly at war with his own mind, slowly losing his humanity in the process. You also have a chick called Trishka.
Damsel in distress, front and center.
Yeah, I gotta be honest, she was a bit of a bitch. I didn't really like her much. And my personal favourite character in the game, aside from Duke Nukem of course.
I can save the world from aliens, but I can't get rid of you.
We'll get to that. Was actually the main villain, General Serrano.
Now, can you half-wits do the math and see the problem we face?
He's telling the truth.
No! Son of a bitch!
Think for a second, boy. You kill me, no jump ship home. You both die. How I see it, I did you a favor.
Seriously, General Serrano is an absolute badass. A really likeable character. It's funny because I got the sense that the developers really wanted the player to hate Serrano, since the characters constantly bitch and whine about how evil and tyrannical he is, and how much they want to take him out. But I really like the character. Nearly every line of dialogue from him made me piss myself laughing, and you could tell that the voice actor had an absolute blast with the character.
Another racial slur and I will hurl you into that storm.
Ah, weak bluff, you prancing geisha.
You actually get to fight alongside him at one point, and I had a lot of fun with it. The story of the game, while not the deepest and most profound, did its bit to accommodate the gameplay, which is of course by far the most important thing. The game constantly gives you a sense of urgency throughout, by reminding you what's at stake, with the team basically being motivated by the need to escape the planet and survive. I mentioned before though how the game does have some tonal inconsistencies. There's times where the game all of a sudden gets really serious and emotional, and some of the cutscenes and bits of dialogue just feel really out of place, particularly when you consider the overall wacky and juvenile tone of the game. Maybe I'm nitpicking here, but it's just something that stood out to me.
If you are not going to cooperate, I have no reason to allow you to live.
Ishi, damn it, put her
Stand
down!
aside. This is my detail. You do what I say. One more betrayal, I will snap your neck.
One feature the game adds is that when you complete the main story, you unlock a new game plus mode called Overkill. This allows you to replay the game with all your weapons and unlocks from the beginning, making the game an absolute blast to replay, giving you an opportunity to find and unlock as many of the skill shots as you can, as well as to find the collectibles. I really appreciate this feature. As I mentioned, the game also has some collectibles to find, such as bottles of alcohol that you can either drink or destroy. The only real purposes these serve are to gain points and unlock achievements. It is what it is. And of course my personal favourite feature in the game, and this is a feature exclusive to the Full Clip Edition. You can actually choose to play through the game, but instead of playing as Gray, you play as Duke Nukem.
How would you know that?
Long story. There was a flashback.
Yeah, I'm not kidding, there's an add-on that lets you play as Duke Nukem. And what's cool about this is that it's not just cosmetic. Duke actually replaces Gray for the entire story, and even has some of his own dialogue.
We had no business surviving that. Someone somewhere wants to see us pull out of this.
They even went as far as to get the legendary John St. John, aka the original voice actor for Duke, to reprise his role for the game.
So how you doing with that, robot thing?
I am engaged in an endless struggle to maintain dominance of my own mind, thank you.
Oh, that's rough. You got any gum?
This blew my mind when I heard about it, since I really wasn't expecting it. It's really funny and bizarre to see how Duke was implemented into the game's story. Basically, he wakes up on the planet and has no memory of how he got there, and seems confused and baffled by the situation. Some of the lines that Duke gets are basically re-recordings of Gray's lines from the main story, and these don't make any sense given the context. Others are actually his own unique lines. These are much funnier and more memorable.
Whoa! I got a surprise for you. That ain't me, babe.
What kind of idiot play was that? So wildly outclassed. Why didn't you morons just warp out?
Outclassed? I've been saving the world since before you were born.
Hey!
Stay cool. Let's keep talking.
Where is the evac point?
Hey!
Are you going to help us?
Knock it off. Neither one of you kids is surviving without me. We help you get to the evac, you help us get off world. That's the deal. I don't know how I got here, but I'm all out of gum.
Occasionally you'll even get a classic Duke Nukem line.
It's time to kick ass and chew bubble gum, and I'm all out of gum.
I will say though, sometimes the suspension of disbelief just wasn't there.
You are going to help me? I am having a difficult time seeing how you can help me. Your drunken thirst for revenge just killed our crew.
You seemed nicer before. Sorry.
You're sorry? You're sorry?
Listen up, robot dude.
I mean, Duke would never let that happen. He would have laid that guy out in a split second, but yeah, I digress. All in all, being able to play as Duke Nukem was badass, and I really appreciate it. The one criticism I have for the feature, though, is that they missed an opportunity to add some of Duke's weapons. Imagine if they added some of the guns from Duke Nukem Forever, such as the freeze ray or the shrink ray. That would have been badass. But it is what it is, I still enjoyed it. So all in all, the game is pretty awesome. A truly great first-person shooter that in my opinion is underrated. I do have some criticisms though. I ran into some technical issues with the game. It appeared to be quite prone to crashing. I'm not sure if this was an issue with my hardware, or the game itself. One technical issue I noticed however was with the game's cutscenes. The lip syncing was really off at times. In fact, in one particular cutscene, Gray just completely broke, and his mouth wouldn't move, and no words came out during the cutscene. It's really weird.
You...
Another issue I had was with the lack of boss battles. The only real boss battles you get are against a giant man-eating plant enemy. That was pretty badass. And a flying section where you take on a giant dinosaur. Aside from that, there's no actual bosses in the game, unless you count those troll-like enemies that you occasionally encounter, some of which can literally be defeated in seconds.
Gee, feeling like I should make some sort of witty comment here.
Or the quick time event where you take on General Serrano. I'm not sure I'd consider either of those boss battles, but I digress. With this being a futuristic, sci-fi style shooter, it's a shame that they never added some more interesting boss battles. Another missed opportunity as far as I'm concerned. I also noticed a bit of an issue in regards to the game's difficulty. I played through the game on normal for my first playthrough, and for the most part the game is very easy. Then near the end you suddenly get a massive difficulty spike, an area that's just jam-packed full of enemies that feels unlike anything else in the game. It's as if the developers realised how easy the game was late in development, and thought they needed to ramp up the difficulty for that one section. It's not a massive problem, it's just something I think makes the difficulty seem a bit unbalanced. That one section was a pain in the ass compared to the rest of the game, but again I digress. Another issue with the game is the ending. Not only is it an incredibly anticlimactic ending, with the plot never being fully resolved, but this is one of them games that even has a sequel bait ending. And as far as I'm aware, the sequel hasn't been released yet all these years later. So yeah, it seems like it's never gonna happen. I really don't like it when games do this, because as I said, it leaves the whole thing feeling anticlimactic, and the plot seems like it has a lot missing from it. But I suppose in a game like this, the story isn't really the most important thing. The gameplay takes priority over it, so it's not a huge issue. As far as the graphics and presentation go, these are a bit of a mixed bag. The levels, backgrounds and environments look nice, and are really well detailed. But the character models, if truth be told, look awful, even for 2011. And they don't look any better in the remastered version. They all have this really weird, unnatural look to them. Particularly Gray, I mean seriously, what's wrong with his mouth? It's not a major issue, but again, it's one of them things that I thought I'd point out. The soundtrack is pretty epic for the most part, and it really suits the overall style and tone of the game. And as I mentioned before, the game is just so varied, and most of it looks great. So yeah, that pretty much sums up my thoughts on Bulletstorm Full Clip Edition. It's a great game for the most part, and it's one of my personal favourite first-person shooters from recent years. I give the game a solid 8 out of 10, a true underrated classic, and one that you guys will probably enjoy if you like classic first-person shooters that are fast-paced and full of awesome badass combat. Thanks for watching guys, I really enjoyed playing and reviewing Bulletstorm. Stay tuned for more retrospective video game reviews. Once again, I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.
Be sensible. We can still get out of this alive.
Sensible ain't my style.